Hey, yo, back again. Just trying to get this book read so that we can get this information in us and move on to continue building brick by brick on the history of these fake ah people pretending, cosplaying to be people of the book that they're not. They are of a book, but it's the Talmud, which has, if I don't know if you've ever seen it, if you're aware of it, just go. I think it's come and hear.org, maybe. Come and see. I think it's come and hear. But there is a lot, like it has the whole Talmud on there, and you can go through it and see what it says about Jesus. It's disgusting. It's absolutely disgusting. Okay. And here's my whole thing. All right. And I know that, like, probably in my first couple of videos on here, I was going ham on Yahweh. And I still, like, Yahweh is not the Most High. Now I've come to wonder, okay, because we know the word play, the sorcery magician language that is the new Hebrew 2.0 that was, quote, revived by a guy named Eleazar Yitzhak Perlman, okay, who later changed his name to, like, Eleazar Yitzhak Yehuda, or Eleazar Yehuda something. Anyways, I think there was some written Hebrew, but really what it basically was Aramaic. And so this is the sleight of hand. These people are dark magicians, okay? And they have created a whole fake parallel history, okay, that's gone side by side with the actual real history. They have made sure that they have sucked the wealth out of every country that had wealth to begin with, and then they have proceeded to subvert said culture, brainwash the entire populace, and get now America is Israel's greatest ally. Wake up, America. Like, stop paying taxes and this shit will cease. Everybody, stop being so afraid. Grow a spine. I'm sorry. I'm not trying to be rude, and I'm not trying to turn you off from watching this video in the first 3 minutes of the video, but I've just had it. Like, I'm going on social media, and everybody looks like people are waking up. But, like, everyone is so afraid. They have been lulled into this slumber of, like, watching sports ball and going out and drinking and gambling. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with these things, but, like, legitimately a group of evil sociopaths has been plotting on us for 1,000 years at least. We got to catch up. Like, it's not okay anymore just to go to work, come home, watch Friends, go to bed, get up. No. Read a book. Start watching some YouTube videos, if you can even find any anymore, that show the truth. The fact that Amazon is buying up all these used books and destroying them should terrify you. But America is still half asleep, and I'm really hoping that this whole thing with this war going on with Iran will wake people up. This whole thing with the flock cameras is waking people up. But what people have to realize is, like, all these tech bros, all these schminists, they are all one and the same. They all worship the devil. They all practice human sacrifice, and they all eat babies. Okay? Allegedly. Anyways, we are in, I think this is chapter 6. Hold on, let me make sure. Chapter 6. Okay, hold on. Let me not lose my place. All right. I think it's chapter 6. Yeah, chapter 6. Where from? Okay. This is section 4 of chapter 6 in the 13th tribe, written by Arthur Kessler. And this is for the purposes of entertainment and education only. So I'm not just sitting here reading a book. I'm reading and commentating, okay? So, the 13th century was a period of partial recovery. We hear for the first time of Jews in regions adjacent to the Rhineland, the Palatinate, AD 1225, Friedberg 1230, Ulm 1243, Heidelberg 1255, etc. But it was to be only a short respite, for the 14th century brought new disasters to Franco-German Jewry. The first catastrophe was the expulsion of all Jews from the royal dominions of Philip le Bel. France had been suffering from an economic crisis to the usual accompaniments of debased currency and social unrest. This is their MO. They suck all the wealth by usury and they subvert the culture. This is what they have done going back 1,000+ years. When are we going to learn? And now they're using this anti-Semitism word as a weapon against you when they're not even Semitic. All right? Okay. France had been suffering from an economic crisis due to the usual accompaniments of debased currency and social unrest. Philip tried to remedy it by the habitual method of soaking the Jews. He exacted from them payments of 100,000 livres in 1292, 215,000 livres in 1295, 1299, 1302, and 1305, then decided on a radical remedy for his ailing finances. On June 21st, 1306, he signed a secret order to arrest all Jews in his kingdom on a given day, confiscate their property, and expel them from the country. The arrests were carried out on July 22nd from the expulsion a few weeks later, and the expulsion was a few weeks later. The refugees emigrated into regions of France outside the king's domain, Provence, Burgundy, Aquitaine, and a few other feudal fiefs. I think it's feudal fiefs. But according to Mises, there are no historical records whatsoever to indicate that German Jewry increased its numbers through the sufferings of the Jewish community in France in the decisive period of its destruction, end quote. And no historian has ever suggested that French Jews trekked across Germany into Poland, either on that occasion or any other time. Under Philip's successors, there was some partial recall of Jews in 1315 and 1350, but they could not undo the damage, nor prevent renewed outbursts of mob persecution. By the end of the 14th century, France, like England, was virtually Judenrein, which means like without J's, basically. I mean, and they act like, they're victims here. They've been kicked out. It's because you guys literally stole all the wealth of the country by offering money at a cost, at interest, and then subverted the culture with your gay shit. I mean, that's literally what it is. No offense to any gays out there, but obviously, civilization cannot survive without hetero business. Come on. Anyway, section 5. The second catastrophe of that disastrous century was the Black Death, which between 1348 and 1350 killed off a third of Europe's population, and in some region, even 2/3. It came from East Asia via Turkestan, and the way it was let loose on Europe and what it did there is symbolic of the lunacy of man. And I kind of, I don't know. I feel like that's another topic that we will broach at some subject is germ theory. I don't believe in it at all. Don't count me out though, because obviously I read books. I'm educated. I am aware of what's going on. I try to tell people during the corona apocalypse, do not get that shot. It will kill you. No one listened. A bunch of people died. Now they're admitting I was right, but whatever. Would rather have been wrong and more people would still be alive today. But these people are out to unalive us, all of us, black, white, green, baloney color, purple, yellow. It don't matter. They're even doing this to their own, quote unquote, own people. All right. They don't give a shit about anyone. Okay. A Tartar leader named Janibeg in 1347 was besieging a town of Kaffa, now Feodosia, in the Crimea, then a Genoese trading port. The plague was rampant in Janibeg's army, so he capitulated the corpses of infected victims into the town, whose population became infected in its turn. That doesn't sound right to me because I know that germs are not spread. So somebody was poisoned is what happened. Genoese ships carried the rats and their deadly fleas eastward into the Mediterranean ports from where they spread inland. Now that we know that mosquitoes and ticks are used as vectors to spread these engineered diseases, okay? And we have another book about that I'm going to be reading, okay? It's called Gain of Function Research. And like people act like, all this technology is new. No. Like the ancients were a lot more high tech than we are, and it was natural. All of this stuff is based on silicon and metals. You know what I'm saying? It's not just through the natural electricity that's in the ether and healing waters and whatnot, and eating food that's not poison. Anyways, don't get me started. Okay. The bacilli of Pastura pestis were not supposed to make a distinction between the various denominations, yet Jews were nevertheless singled out for special treatment. Of course they were. After being accused earlier on of the ritual slaughter of Christian children, they were now accused of poisoning the wells to spread the Black Death. And they probably did. Because they're still trying to poison and kill us all now. Who do you think owns all these drug companies? Who do you think owns all of this shit? Zionists. Okay, the legend traveled faster even than the rats, and consequences was the burning of jays en masse all over Europe. Once more, suicide by mutual self-immolation became a common expedient to avoid being burned alive. The decimation population of Western Europe did not reach again its pre-plague level until the 16th century. As for its jays, who had been exposed to the twofold attack of rats and men, only a fraction survived. As Kutschera wrote, the populace avenged on them the cruel blows of destiny and set upon those whom the plague had spared with fire and sword. When the epidemics receded, Germany, according to contemporary historians, was left virtually without Jews. We are led to conclude that Germany itself, the Jews could not prosper and were never able to establish large and populous communities. How then, in these circumstances, should they have been able to lay the foundations in Poland of mass population so dense that at present, AD 1909, it outnumbers the Jews of Germany at the rate of 10 to 1? It is indeed difficult to understand how the idea ever gained ground that the Eastern Jews represented immigrants from the West, and especially from Germany. All they do is lie. And this whole biological warfare is nothing new too. As you can see, it goes back 1,000 years. So, don't be surprised here. Yet next to the First Crusade, the Black Death is most frequently invoked by historians as Deus ex machina, which created Eastern Jewry. And just in case of the Crusades, there is not a shred of evidence for this imaginary exodus. On the contrary, the indications are that the Jews' only hope of survival on this, as on the earlier occasions, was to stick together and seek shelter in some fortified place or less hostile surroundings in the vicinity. There is only one case of an emigration in the Black Death period mentioned by Mises. Jews from the Spires took refuge from persecution in Heidelberg, about 10 miles away. After the virtual extermination of the old Jewish communities in France and Germany in the wake of the Black Death, Western Europe remained Judenrein for a couple of centuries, with only a few enclaves vegetating on, except in Spain, where the Sephardi's were. It was an entirely different stock of Jews who founded the modern communities of England, France, and Holland in the 16th and 17th centuries, the Sephardim, the Spanish Jews, forced to flee from Spain, where they had been resident for more than a millennium. Their history and the history of modern European Jewry lies outside the scope of this book. We may safely conclude that the traditional idea of a mass exodus of Western Jewry from the Rhineland to Poland all across Germany, a hostile Jewless glacis, is historically untenable. It is incompatible with the small size of the Rhenish communities, their reluctance to branch out from the Rhine Valley towards the east, their stereotyped behavior and adversity, and the absence of references to migratory movements in contemporary chronicles. Further evidence for this view is provided by linguistics to be discussed in Chapter 7, which I find to be very fascinating, the linguistics, because that's what they do. They play word games. It's sigil magic. That's what they're doing. And I just find it to be interesting that even this guy admits that a lot of this proclaimed Jayish history or whatever is nonsense. It's like it cannot be corroborated by anything in history. So they love to make up shit. This is Chapter 7, Cross Currents, Section 1. On the evidence quoted in previous chapters, one can easily understand why Polish historians, who are, after all, closest to the sources, are in agreement that, quote, in earlier times, the main bulk of the Jewish population originated from the Khazar country, end quote. Not from the Levant, not from Palestine, from the steppes of the Caucasus Mountains, okay? One might even be tempted to overstate the case by claiming, as Kutschera does, that Eastern Jewry was 100% of Khazar origin. Such a claim might be tenable if the ill-fated Franco-Rhenish community were only rival in the search for paternity. But in the latter Middle Ages, things become more complicated by the rise and fall of Jewish settlements all over the territories of the former Austro-Hungarian monarchy and the Balkans. Thus, not only Vienna and Prague had a considerable Jewish population, but there are no less than 5 places called Judendorf, which means, quote, Jew village, end quote, in the Carinthian Alps, and more Judenbergs and Judenstadts in the mountains of Styria? Oh, weird. By the end of the 15th century, the Jews were expelled from both provinces and went to Italy, Poland, and Hungary. But where did they originally come from? Certainly not from the West, as Mises put in his survey of these scattered communities, like they fucking claim. During the High Middle Ages, we thus find in the East a chain of settlements stretching from Bavaria to Persia, the Caucasus, Asia Minor, and Byzantium. But westward from Bavaria, there is a gap through the whole length of Germany. Just how this immigration of Jews into the Alpine regions came about, we do not know, but without doubt, the 3 great reservoirs of Jews from the late antiquity played their part: Italy, Byzantium, and Persia. The missing link in this enumeration is once again Khazaria, which, as we have seen earlier on, served as a receptacle and transit station for Jews emigrating from Byzantium and the Caliphate. Mises has acquired great merit in refuting the legend of the Rhenish origin of Eastern Jewry. But he too knew little of Khazar history and was unaware of its demographic importance. However, he may have been right in suggesting an Italian component among the immigrants to Austria. Italy was not only quasi-saturated with Jews since Roman times, but, like Khazaria, also received its share of immigrants from Byzantium. So here we might have a trickle of, quote, genuine Jews of Semitic origin into Eastern Europe, but I doubt it. Okay. Okay, where was I? Whereas there are plenty of evidence of a reverse migration of Jews into Italy after their expulsion from the Alpine provinces at the end of the 15th century. Details like this tend to blur the picture, which is exactly what they want, and make one wish that the Jews had gone to Poland on board the Mayflower with all the records neatly kept. Yet the broad outlines of the migratory process are nevertheless discernible. The Alpine settlements were in all likelihood westerly offshoots of the general Khazar migration toward Poland, which was spread over several centuries and followed several different routes through the Ukraine, the Slavonic regions north of Hungary, perhaps also through the Balkans. A Romanian legend tells of an invasion, the date unknown, of armed Jews into that country. Section 2. There is another very curious legend relating to the history of Austrian Jewry. It was launched by Christian chronicles in the Middle Ages, but was repeated in all seriousness by historians as late as the beginning of the 18th century. In pre-Christian days, so the legend goes, the Austrian provinces were ruled by a succession of Jewish princes. The Austrian Chronicle, compiled by a Viennese scribe in the reign of Albert III, from 1350 to 1395, contains a list of no less than 22 such Jewish princes who are said to have succeeded each other. The list gives not only their alleged names, some of which have distinctly Ural-Altaian ring, have a distinctly Ural-Altaian ring, but also the length of their rule and the place where they are buried. Thus, quote, Sennen ruled 45 years, buried at the Stubentor in Vienna, Zippen 43, buried in Tulln, and so on, including names like Lapton, Mayalan, Rapton, Rabon, Ephra, Samek, etc. After these Jews came 5 pagan princes, followed by Christian rulers. The legend is repeated with some variations in the Latin histories of Austria by Henricus Gundulfingus. What a weird name. Henricus Gundulfingus. 1474, and by several others, and the last one being Anselmus Schramm's Floris Chronicorum Austriae, 1702, who still seems to have believed in its authenticity. How could this fantastic tale have originated? Let us listen to Mises again. Quote, the very fact that such a legend could develop and stubbornly maintain itself through several centuries indicates that deep in the national consciousness of ancient Austria, dim memories persisted of a Jewish presence in the land on the upper Danube in bygone days. Who knows whether the tidal waves emanating from the Khazar dominions in Eastern Europe once swept into the foothills of the Alps, which would explain the Turanian flavor of the names of those princes. The confabulations of medieval chroniclers could evoke a popular echo only if they were supported by collective recollections, however vague. As already mentioned, Mises is rather inclined to underestimate the Khazar contribution to Jewish history. Of course he is, because he wants to be seen as biblical, but they're not. But even so, he hit on the only plausible hypothesis which could explain the origin of the persistent legend. One may even venture to be a little more specific. For more than half a century, up to AD 955, Austria, as far west as the river Enns, was under Hungarian domination. The Magyars had arrived in their new country in 896, together with the Kabar-Khazar tribes, who were influential in the nation. The Hungarians at the time were not yet converted to Christianity. That happened only a century later, AD 1000, and the only monotheistic religion familiar to them was Khazar Judaism, or Talmudism. There may have been one or more tribal chieftains among them who practiced a Judaism of sorts. We remember the Byzantine chronicler John Cinemus mentioning Jewish troops fighting in the Hungarian army. Thus, there may have been some substance to the legend, particularly if we remember that the Hungarians were still in their savage raiding period, the scourge of Europe. To be under their dominion was certainly a traumatic experience, which the Austrians were unlikely to forget. It all fits rather nicely. Section 3. Further evidence against the supposedly Franco-Rhenish origin of Eastern Uri is provided by structure of Yiddish, the popular language of the Jewish masses, spoken by millions before the Holocaust and still surviving among traditionalist minorities in the Soviet Union and the United States. Yiddish is a curious amalgam of Hebrew, medieval German, Slavonic, and other elements written in Hebrew characters. And it's not Hebrew characters, it's Aramaic characters. They stole the Aramaic alphabet. They speak Yiddish, but they call it Hebrew. This is the brainwash, bro. And then they've got their Leningrad Codex. It's like 1,000 years older than the Greek LXX. Like, let's just be so for real. These people are liars. Now that it is dying out, has it become a subject of such much academic research in the United States and Israel, but until well into the 20th century, it was considered by Western linguists as merely an odd jargon, hardly worth serious study. Of course. As H. Smith remarked, quote, little attention has been paid to Yiddish by scholars because if they pay attention to it, they'll realize that modern Hebrew is Yiddish. Apart from a few articles and periodicals, the first really scientific study of the language was Mises' historical grammar. I feel like this Mises character is a glazer, if you will. He be glazing. Historical, published in 1924. It is significant that the latest edition of the Standard Historical Grammar of German, which treats German from the point of view of its dialects, dismisses Yiddish in 12 lines. At first glance, the prevalence of German loanwords in Yiddish seems to contradict our main thesis on the origin of Eastern Uri. We shall see presently that the opposite is true, but the argument involves several steps. The first is to inquire what particular kind of regional German dialect went into the Yiddish vocabulary. Nobody before Mises seems to have paid serious attention to this question. It is to his lasting merit to have done so and to have come up with a conclusive answer. Based on the study of the vocabulary, phonetics, and syntax of Yiddish as compared with the main German dialects in the Middle Ages, he concludes, no linguistic components derived from the parts of Germany bordering on France are found in the Yiddish language. Not a single word from the entire list of specifically Moselle Franconian origin compiled by J.A. Ballas. There's a bunch of shit in German that I'm not going to read, has found its way into the Yiddish vocabulary. Even more central regions of Western Germany around Frankfurt have not contributed to the Yiddish language. Bullshit. Insofar as the origins of Yiddish are concerned, Western Germany can be written off. Could it be that the generally accepted view according to which the German Jews once upon a time immigrated from France across the Rhine is misconceived? The history of German Jews of Ashkenazi Jewry must be revised. The errors of history are often rectified by linguistic research. The conventional view of the erstwhile immigration of Ashkenazi Jews from France belongs to the category of historic errors which are awaiting correction. Well, then why is it still Googleable that literally this language is Yiddish is mostly German with a few other Eastern European languages mixed in? I feel like this Mises guy is a liar. He then quotes, among other examples of historic fallacies, the case of the Gypsies, who were regarded as an offshoot from Egypt, quote, until linguistics show that they come from India, end quote. Having disposed of the alleged Western origin of the Germanic element in Yiddish, Mises went on to show that the dominant influence in it are so-called East Middle German dialects, which were spoken in the Alpine regions of Austria and Bavaria roughly up to the 15th century. So it's German! He's splitting hairs. In other words, the German component which went into the hybrid Jewish language originated in the eastern regions of Germany, adjacent to the Slavonic belt of Eastern Europe. That's what I fucking said. I mean, do you see? Do you see? No, it's not German. It's not German at all. Well, I mean, it's Eastern German. You know, it's kind of close to the border, so it's not really German. It's German, bro. It's fucking German. These people are such disgusting liars. Like, I'm getting disgusted the more I read this book. Thus, the evidence from linguistics supports the historical record in refuting the misconception of the Franco-Rhenish origins of Eastern Jewry. But this negative evidence does not answer the question how an East Middle German dialect combined with... It's not Hebrew, bro. And Slavonic elements became the common language of that Eastern Jewry, the majority of which we assume to have been of Khazar origin. Hebrew was dead, okay? Hebrew was dead even in the day of Jesus. The Masoretes made up a language from Aramaic, so, and I think that was still only in written form, in the block, quote-unquote, Hebrew script, which is basically an adaptation of Aramaic. It's just, this shit is wild to me, dude. It's wild to me. Okay. Let me calm down. Okay. The majority of which we assume to have been of Khazar origin. In attempting to answer this question, several factors have to be taken into consideration. First, the evolution of Yiddish was a long and complex process, which presumably started in the 15th century or even earlier, yet it remained for a long time a spoken language, a kind of lingua franca, and appears in print only in the 19th century. Before that, it had no established grammar, and it was, quote, left to the individual to introduce foreign words as he desires. There is no established form of pronunciation or spelling. The chaos in spelling may be illustrated by the rules laid down in the Jüdische Volksbibliothek. 1. Write as you speak. And 2. Write so that both Polish and Lithuanian Jews may understand you. And 3. Spell differently words of the same sound which have a different signification. End quote. Thus, Yiddish grew through the centuries by a kind of untrammeled proliferation, avidly absorbing from its social environment such words and phrases, idiomatic expressions as best served its purpose as a lingua franca. But the culturally and socially dominant element in the environment of medieval Poland were the Germans. They alone among the immigrant populations were economically and intellectually more influential than the Jews. We have seen that from the early days of the Piast dynasty, and particularly under Casimir the Great. Everything was done to attract immigrants to colonize the land and build, quote, modern cities. Casimir is said to have, quote, found a country of wood, left a country of stone, end quote. But these new cities of stone, such as Krakow or Limburg, were built and ruled by German immigrants living under the so-called Magdeburg Law, i.e. enjoying a high degree of municipal self-government. Altogether, not less than 4 million Germans are said to have immigrated into Poland, providing it with an urban middle class that it had not possessed before. As Polyak has put it in comparing the German to the Khazar immigration into Poland, quote, the rulers of the country imported these masses of much-needed enterprising foreigners and facilitated their settling down according to the way of life they had been used to in their countries of origin, the German town and the Jewish shtetl. However, this tidy separation became blurred when later Jewish arrivals from the West also settled in the towns and formed urban ghettos themselves. They act like they were just thrown into them. No, they segregated themselves and then want to act like victims because that's what they do. Not only the educated bourgeoisie, but the clergy too was predominantly German, a natural consequence of Poland opting for Roman Catholicism and turning toward Western civilization, just as the Russian clergy, after Vladimir's conversion to Greek Orthodoxy, was predominantly Byzantine. Secular culture followed along the same lines, in the footsteps of the older Western neighbor. The first Polish university was founded in 1364 in Krakow, then a predominantly German city. One of its students in the next century was Nicholas Copernicus, or Mikolaj Kopernik, with whom Polish and German patriots later claimed as their national. As Kutschera the Austrian has put it rather smugly, the German colonists were at first regarded by the people with suspicion and distrust, yet they succeeded in gaining an increasingly firm foothold and even in introducing the German educational system. The Poles learned to appreciate the advantages of the higher culture introduced by the Germans and to imitate their foreign ways. The Polish aristocracy, too, grew fond of German customs and found beauty and pleasure in whatever came from Germany. Not exactly modest, but essentially true. One remembers the high esteem for German culture among 19th century Russian intellectuals. It is easy to see why Khazar immigrants pouring into medieval Poland had to learn German if they wanted to get on. Those who had close dealings with the native populace had no doubt also to learn some pidgin, Polish, or Lithuanian, or Ukrainian, or Slovene. German, however, was a prime necessity in any contact with the towns, but there was also the synagogue and the study of Hebrew Torah. One can visualize a shtetl craftsman, a cobbler perhaps, or a timber merchant speaking broken German to his clients, broken Polish to the serfs on the estate next door, and at home mixing the most expressive bits of both with, quote, Hebrew. It's Masoretic. It's what it is. It's Masoretic Aramaic. It's not Hebrew, into a kind of intimate, private language. How this hodgepodge became communalized and standardized in the extent to which it did is any linguist's guess, but at least one can discern some further factors which facilitated the process. Among the later immigrants to Poland, there were also, as we have seen, a certain number of, quote, real Jews, which whatever that fucking means, from the Alpine countries, Bohemia and Eastern Germany. Even if their number was relatively small, these German-speaking Jews were superior in culture and learning to the Khazars, just as the German Gentiles were culturally superior to the Poles, and just as the Catholic clergy was German to the Jewish rabbis from the West, were a powerful factor in the Germanization of the Khazars, whose Judaism was fervent but primitive. To quote Polyak again, those German Jews who reached the kingdom of Poland-Lithuania had an enormous influence on their brethren from the East. The reason why the Khazar Jews were so strongly attracted to them was that they admired their religious learning and their efficiency in doing business with the predominantly German cities. The language spoken at the Heder, the school for religious teaching, and at the house of the Gavir, notable rich man, would influence the language of the whole community. A rabbinical tract from 17th century Poland contains the pious wish, quote, may God will that the country be filled with wisdom and that all Jews speak German, end quote. Characteristically, only the sector among the Khazarian Jews in Poland which resisted both the spiritual and worldly temptations offered by the German language were the Karaites, who rejected both rabbinical learning and material enrichment. Thus, they never took to Yiddish. According to the first all-Russian consensus, In 1897, there were 12,894 Karaite Jews living in the Tsarist Empire, which of course included Poland. Of these, 9,666 gave Turkish as their mother tongue, i.e., presumably their original Khazar dialect. 2,632 spoke Russian and only 383 spoke Yiddish. The Karaite sect, however, represents the exception rather than the rule. And see, and that's what I'm saying. Everybody thinks that all these Jews are practicing Torah. No, they are not. The Karaites, still to this day, I think, are one of the few that really only do. All the rest of them, like, practice Talmud. And it's fine if you want to practice Torah, but, like, you're not going to be, your salvation's not going to come from that. Only faith in Jesus Christ. Okay? There is no other way. There is no other name under heaven by which men can be saved. So all of y'all invoking Yahweh and all this Jehovah and all this crap, calling the Heavenly Father that ain't his name, bro. Just stop. You've been brainwashed by a bunch of Jews. All right. The Karaite sect, however, represents the exception rather than the rule. In general, immigrant populations settling in a new country tend to shed their original language within 2 or 3 generations and adopt the language of their new country. This does not, of course, apply to conquerors and colonizers who impose their own language on the natives. Duh. The American grandchildren of immigrants from Eastern Europe never learned to speak Polish or Ukrainian and find the Jabberwocky of their grandparents rather comic. It is difficult to see how historians could ignore the evidence for the Khazar migration into Poland on the grounds that more than half a millennium later they speak a different language. Incidentally, the descendants of the biblical tribes are the classic example of linguistic adaptability. First, they spoke Hebrew. In the Babylonian exile, Chaldean. At the time of Jesus, Aramaic. In Alexandria, Greek. In Spain, Arabic. But later, Ladino, a Spanish-Hebrew mixture, written in Hebrew characters, the Sephardi equivalent of Yiddish. And so it goes on. See, that's what I'm saying. They call it Hebrew characters. It's Aramaic characters, bro. And when you start looking back at it, like Father Abraham didn't speak Hebrew. He spoke some Ugaritic language. It's like they're saying that this Hebrew language existed, and I'm really wondering, did it ever? Because, you know, they had their quote-unquote Torah scrolls or whatever, but we're told that the Greek Septuagint was transferred at the time of Ptolemy, right, into the Greek. So Jesus didn't speak Hebrew, right? And then in the Babylonian captivity in the time of the Second Temple period, or right before that, they were speaking whatever language the Babylonians were speaking. Like, they lost their language. That's why it was considered a dead language even in Jesus' day. So, and there's a lot of debate about, you know, the characters and where it came from. And it looks like they literally borrowed their alphabet from Aramaic. So, you know, whatever. Okay. All right. Okay. And so it goes on. They preserved their religious identity, but changed languages at their convenience. How convenient. The Khazars were not descended from the tribes, but as we have seen, they shared a certain cosmopolitanism and other social characteristics with their co-religionists. That doesn't mean anything. They are not blood Hebrews. Okay, this is the 4th section. I'm starting to get irritated. And it's not anything to do with y'all. There's just a toddler river dancing right above my head, and it sounds like there's a thunderstorm going on. It's like, take him outside and let him play. I digress. Section 4. Polyak has proposed an additional hypothesis concerning the early origins of Yiddish, which deserves to be mentioned, though it is rather problematical. He thinks that the, quote, shape of the early Yiddish emerged in the Gothic regions of the Khazar Crimea. In those regions, the conditions of life were bound to bring about a combination of Germanic and, quote, Hebrew elements. I hate that they call it Hebrew, because it's not. Hundreds of years before the foundation of the settlements in the kingdoms of Poland and Lithuania. Polyak quotes as indirect evidence a certain Joseph Barbaro of Venice, who lived in Tana, an Italian merchant colony on the Don estuary. from 1436 to 1452, and who wrote that his German servant could converse with a Goth from the Crimea just as a Florentine could understand the language of an Italian from Genoa. As a matter of fact, the Gothic language survived in the Crimea and apparently nowhere else, at least to the middle of the 16th century. At the time, the Habsburgs, ambassador in Constantinople, Habsburgs, inbreeders, the Gisland de Busbecq met people from the Crimea and made a list of words from the Gothic that they spoke. This Busbecq must have been a remarkable man, for it was he who first introduced the lilac and tulip from the Levant to Europe. Poliak considers this vocabulary to be close to the Middle High German elements found in Yiddish. He thinks the Crimean Goths kept contact with other Germanic tribes and that their language was influenced by them. Whatever one may think of it, is a hypothesis worth a linguist's attention. All right, we're going to read section 5 and then I'm going to stop. Quote, in a sense, wrote Cecil Roth, quote, the Jewish Dark Ages may be said to begin with the Renaissance, end quote. Earlier on, there had been massacres and other forms of persecution during the Crusades, the Black Death, and under other pretexts. But these had been lawless outbreaks of mass violence, actively opposed or passively tolerated by the authorities. From the beginnings of the Counter-Reformation, however, the Jays were legally degraded to not quite human status, in many respects comparable to the untouchables in the Hindu caste system. I mean, look at how they behave. Quote, the few communities suffered to remain in Western Europe, i.e. in Italy, Germany, and the papal possessions in southern France, were subject at last to all the restrictions which earlier ages had usually allowed to remain an ideal, end quote, i.e. which had existed on ecclesiastical and other decrees, but had remained on paper, as for instance in Hungary. Now, however, these ideal ordinances were ruthlessly enforced. Residential segregation, sexual apartheid, exclusion from all respected positions and occupations, wearing of distinctive clothes, yellow badge and conical headgear. In 1555, Pope Paul IV, in his bull Cum Nimis Absurdum, insisted on the strict and consistent enforcement of earlier edicts, confining Jews to closed ghettos. A year later, the Jews of Rome were forcibly transferred. All Catholic countries where Jews still enjoyed relative freedom of movement had to follow the example. In Poland, the honeymoon period, inaugurated by Casimir the Great, had lasted longer than elsewhere, but by the end of the 16th century, it had run its course. The Jewish communities, now confined to a shtetl and ghetto, became overcrowded. But I thought they wanted to be, by themselves, right? But now I guess when everyone's had just about enough of your bullshit, and they put you in your own little area to stay the F away from everyone else because you literally suck everything dry and subvert the culture to a low vibe, whatever, then you're the victims, right? Okay. In Poland, the honeymoon period, inaugurated by Casimir the Great, had lasted longer than elsewhere, but by the end of the 16th century, it had run its course. The Jewish communities, now confined to shtetl and ghetto, became overcrowded, and the refugees from the Cossack massacres in the Ukrainian villages under Chmelnyky led to a rapid deterioration of the housing situation and economic conditions. The result was a new wave of massive immigration into Hungary, Bohemia, Romania, and Germany, where the Jews who had all but vanished with the Black Death were still thinly spread. But it's all it takes is just, like 5% of them out of the whole population to subvert the whole entire world, apparently. Thus, the great trek into the West was resumed. It was continued through nearly 3 centuries until the Second World War, which, if you go back and listen to my reading of Facts Are Facts, they were a cause of World War I and definitely the cause of World War II. Because all wars are bankers' wars and all bankers are Jews. So, okay. It was to continue through nearly 3 centuries until the Second World War and became the principal source of the existing Jewish communities in Europe, the United States, and Israel. When its rate of flow slackened, the pogroms of the 19th century provided new impetus. Quote, the Second Western Movement, end quote, writes Roth, dating the first from the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, which they were not a part of because they were not Hebrew. They were not Judeans. This little wordplay, these little mind games, this trickery, this sleight of hand, which continued into the 20th century, may be said to begin with the deadly Semetic massacres of 1648 through 49 in Poland, end quote. And I might go a little bit over. Okay, yeah, because we're going to finish the chapter. This is section 6, the end of this chapter. The evidence quoted in previous chapters adds up to a strong case in favor of those modern historians, whether Austrian, Israeli, or Polish, who independently from each other have argued that the bulk of modern Jewry is not of Palestinian, but of Caucasian origin. Like I've been saying for a decade, they are the true Caucasians. So do not call me Caucasian, because that ain't my people. I'm Anglo-Saxon, okay? And words matter, and they mean things. So just, know that. The mainstream of Jewish migrations did not flow from the Mediterranean across France and Germany to the east and then back again. No, the stream moved in a consistently westerly direction from the Caucasus through the Ukraine into Poland and thence into Central Europe. When that unprecedented mass settlement in Poland came into being, there were simply not enough Jews around in the west to account for it, while in the east a whole nation was on the move to new frontiers. It, of course, could be foolish to deny that Jews of different origin also contributed to the existing Jewish world community. The numerical ratio of the Khazar to the Semitic and other contributions is impossible to establish because they were freaking scattered. They were scattered. And all the genealogies were destroyed when Jesus returned in the 1st century. There is no longer Jew or Greek. We're all one in Christ. So all this Jew stuff is ridiculous. It would, of course, be... Okay. The numerical ratio of the Khazar to the Semetic and other contributors is impossible, but the cumulative evidence makes one inclined to agree with the consensus of Polish historians that, quote, in earlier times, the main bulk originated from the Khazar country, end quote, and that accordingly, the Khazar contribution to the genetic makeup of the Jews must be substantial and in all likelihood dominant. That's why they cannot just go to CVS and get a 23andMe, okay? They can't do it because they will then find out that they're not actual Semites. Their whole government's been lying to them. Their religious leaders have been lying to them. I mean, it's satanic. What's going on is satanic with these people. Anyways, I love you guys. BS detector out for a little while, and then I'll come back. I think I want to do like a perfume video next because I'm talking about these people gets me like really upset. Anyways, love you guys. It's just too much BS.